So welcome to the second AABR Fest 2024. The purpose of the next 2 days is to provide you folks with an introduction to various aspects of bushland restoration, and there's going to be people talking about things that will deal with restoration at broader spatial and timescales, and what I shall be doing is talking about the more on the ground, dirty, smaller scale stuff, because that's the stuff I do, and that's the stuff I've been thinking about an enormous amount over the past couple of years. Most of my bush regeneration experience has been in Sydney. 3 years ago, I moved up the coast where we deal with much larger sites, and we tend to use different modes of operation as well, okay? And so that's got me thinking an awful lot about how do I change the way I think about bush regen and apply those different ways of treating things and different strategies of bushland restoration, and how can I boil that down into some basic rules of play that maybe other people could understand and remember as well. You know, the bushland, it's a disorderly mess, right? You know, as it is now, it's very disorderly, and you add weeds into the mix as well, and you've got even more interactions going on. You know, think of, you've got all these different species, you've got different plant functional groups, they're interacting, they've got their own, think of it like a machine. These are all components to a large complicated machine that's often behaving in ways that we don't understand. And all these components are playing off each other, they're competing for each other, they're modifying each other's environment, or they're actually maybe even aiding each other in one way or the other. So how do we pull that apart and sort of like be able to utilize, you know, all these different interactions and behaviours, hey? You know, and we need to be able to do this in order to operate as efficiently as possible and get as much done as we can for the financial and the time budget that we have available. And that's critical. That kind of underlies why I'm sort of here talking about this sort of thing and why I've been thinking about it in the first place. I want to run through 14 points, okay, over the course of about an hour or so. And it would be good if I could get some feedback from people too. So I can provide some examples to illustrate the kind of principle that I'm trying to get across. But if other people have experience as well, that would be really useful. First principle we need to work with is, you know, our founding document. What does the contract say? If you are working on a team, you may not necessarily be the supervisor, so you may not be privy to what the contract says, okay? But ideally, if you are introduced to a site for the first time, you are given a rundown as to what the main aims of the contract are, and you take it from there. That you really, everyone really needs that sort of an introduction, because then that helps you get your head in the right space and you can apportion things properly over the course of the day or over the course of the next few years or so when you're operating, all right? If you're a supervisor or if you have submitted the contract tender to hopefully win the contract, then you will be familiar with what the contractor is asking for. This may be national parks, this may be council, this may be private groups, you know, land care, NGOs, all the rest of it, okay? Because the amount of time and the amount of budget you have to invest in a site it always feels limited. You have to work with maximum efficiency. So you don't want to be spending 20% of your time working in a particular area on the site and then find out later, oh, actually, that wasn't the main, you know, that was a minor goal or something. You really need to be able to order in your mind what are the primary goals of the contract and base your strategy off that. So the foundation document, you know, is what are the targets and goals defined by the contract. Everything starts from there. And secondly, what is the site boundary set in the contract? We have to work over a site and have in mind, in our imaginations, an overlay on that site. And the first part of that overlay is, where is our site boundary? If you have submitted a tender for a contract, you ideally will have walked the whole site, walked literally the whole boundary to understand the site, okay? So when we are working over a contract site, we have to have that map in our mind. You don't want to be, obviously, you don't want to be working in some creek line or something and then find out you've spent 5 or 10% of your budget or something actually just working over the boundary on the other side of the creek. You know, that's for a different mob or something like that. One, it looks silly, and two, it's taking time away from what might be more critical tasks. You know, you as a contractor, say for example working for council, you will be liaisoning with an officer who will want you to do certain things, and they want you to do them up to a certain standard, and there may be set components that do actually have to be completed, not just work towards but be completed. That means you need to be very focused, and you can't afford to fritter away time accidentally over a boundary or something like that. I don't know if anyone's had the experience of working on a site and finding that you've just spent half the day actually on a neighbouring site or in a national park or in another LGA or something like that. Has anyone? Hopefully not, but you have? What was your experience there? What was your experience there?
Tackled a good section of land kind of that was just off the site boundary. The neighbours were very happy, yeah, so it was a waste of a couple of hours, but you know.
Okay, at least it was only a couple of hours. And we know weeds, you know, weeds don't believe in frontiers. So on the odd occasion I have worked across a boundary too, but that's been done consciously because I've known that there is a seed source or something like that over the boundary, and so it is going to help me in my area, okay? But it's a conscious thing of, okay, how much time can I kind of bleed out of the written, you know, the hard boundary where I'm supposed to be behaving for the sake of what's in the reserve, hey?
Spend an hour save yourself a day kind of thing.
Exactly, that's right, like down the line later, yeah. This stuff doesn't interest me quite so much, I must admit, but it's critical. You know, you don't build a house and position it askew on a foundation. It sits on the foundation, it sits on the contract, and it sits on the boundary. And you need to know where that boundary is, and you need to have a map in your mind and on paper of the site that you're working at. Everything rests on that. I cannot state that more strongly.
I wonder about even things like insurance, and if someone is injured on that job over, outside the boundaries of the contract.
Yeah.
What are there are legal implications and all that sort of stuff if you're working on someone else's land, all that sort of stuff. So there goes along with it a whole bunch of other issues.
That's a good point. Well. Yeah. And the contract may specify more than just doing restoration work as well. Often, there's an aesthetic component or something. You've got to work along say a track where a lot of people walk or ride their bikes or whatever, or a road edge that's visible to houses and residents and that sort of thing. It's not just about ecological restoration. Often to the frustration of people working there. But there are other components as well. And there's planting, which again is a very time critical task. So enough about that. Often over the past couple of years, I've spent time, say on a Friday afternoon, sitting in my backyard, looking at the weeds coming up. And there's not enough weeds, actually, because weeds bring insects and birds and all the rest. But thinking about how have I been operating at these various sites over the course of the week, and how can I improve what I'm doing, and why have I found doing this, working in this mode or that mode kind of difficult, or it's not gelling yet. Coming from Sydney, working on very small sites intensely, often from one side to the other, to moving up the coast, working on areas that are measured in hectares, hundreds of hectares, You need a different mode, and working efficiently that's what it's all about, So it gets you thinking about what you're doing a lot. And I've come to various conclusions and insights that, yes, my supervisor has been trying to beat various insights into me, but then that only goes so far, and sometimes you have to look at something anew yourself, and it's like, bing, yes, something's just settled comfortably, and now I've got it. And so it's some of those insights plus others that I've tried to boil down into some basic rules. The ecology of a bushland, this messy machine, is so complex. Wouldn't it be nice if we could go in there with like a set of a dozen rules or ways of looking at it, and it's like, okay, there's this, and I look at it in terms of these terms, and then in terms of these terms, and now I can understand what my priorities might be and how to work most efficiently in the bushland, for a particular job. That's kind of the purpose of this presentation here. So if you're new to bushland and bushland restoration, maybe just one or two of these points is all that you'll remember in a few days. That may well be enough anyway. If you remember all of them, or you're probably already familiar with some of them as well, and I don't think it hurts to re-familiarise yourself. And despite how much experience you might have at something, I think it's good to go back to the basics and remind yourself, because then that can that can bring back a structure to the way that you think, and that can also mean that you can communicate that more effectively to other people as well. And this is our AABR Fest, and this is all about communication over the next 2 days and talking about this sort of thing. So the first thing, and it's one of the fun things, is understanding the players' life cycles, okay? If you are into Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, you've got various characters and they have various weaknesses and various strengths. And indeed, you can buy off, additional strengths and powers and that sort of thing. You've got a game, you've got a potentially very complex game, and these players fit into it and are capable of doing certain things and not capable of doing other things. These are the players in your game here. I can see just at the moment native players. If we had some weeds here as well, then it might make things a bit easier to explain. But anyway, we've got a whole range of organisms here and they have different life cycles. Some of them require bushfire to germinate. Others are able to germinate from seed in the ground in the absence of fire or disturbance. Some things will germinate and grow and seed within a season. Other things need to invest 5 years or 10 years in growth and increasing in size before they can start their reproduction. You've got a whole load of different things in between. Some of these players need high light conditions. Some of these players are quite, maybe not necessarily here, let's say this is a rainforest, then some of these players are quite capable of going through their whole life cycle in shade, right? Some of these players are quite capable of germinating in shade and growing, but they're not going to really play the full to their full capacity until they get to high light conditions in the canopy. Everything grows out of the ground. Everything is after sunlight, for example, but some things take shortcuts, and rather than building their own support skeletons, they, not that I can see any vines here, there are some players that will use the skeletons of other players instead. So you've got vines growing up over the tops of canopies of trees. Another strategy again. We can throw all of these different players into certain groups. We don't really need to know intimately the life cycles of all these different species. If we can look at them in terms of their function, then we can drop them into certain categories. We've got, to make the point simple, we've got our grasses. Their behaviour tends to be fairly similar, okay? Or we might have, say, in a rainforest, slow growing trees that produce really large seeds that are capable of germinating in deep shade. That's another functional group. Yeah, we do like to know what all the different species are, but in the absence of that, if you can look at the plants and look at their structure, then you can make inferences about their behaviour and their life cycles, okay? And drop them into certain functional categories. Call those your groups of players, okay? So what you're doing is you're looking at this mess and you're simplifying it. And that is critical when you are on a site and you're trying to anticipate, okay, how is this game going to roll on over the next 2 months, 2 years, 20 years or so. That brings me to the second point then is, how is the vegetation changing over time? Often we get to site and it's already, the supervisor or the boss already understands the site because they've been working it for a few years, and so we just launch into doing whatever we're asked to do. Target this or target that. But I think it's really useful to get to a site and just take, if you can, just a few minutes to stand and look at what's in front of you and break down what you're seeing into these different categories and see what is happening with each of these different plant functional groups. And then think about, okay, these are the processes that are happening. Where are we going to be in 2 years or 20 years? So we've got a lantana here, we've got a lantana here, and one over there. That's all we have in the bush at the moment. Let's roll time forward now and see what's going to happen. We know that the lantana is capable of producing seed, spreading seed via birds, germinating in the absence of bushfire or disturbance. So over a few years, that lantana is going to have its growing family around there. That lantana is going to have its growing family around there. They're going to be dispersing cousins around. The lantana is getting thicker. You know what I mean? So we're seeing how the site and the vegetation is changing over time in our mind. That allows us to prioritise what we need to do. We got lantana doing this, we got lantana doing that. We got fishbone doing something else, and we've got, say, some herb doing something else. And it might be that, well, the fishbone, yeah, that's going to go really densely, but its front is going to move slowly through the bushland. So maybe that's not such a priority for the next year or two. The lantana, well, that's going to move slowly for the next year or two, but it's capable of covering, sending off its cousins over long distances. And this is a big site. And if we don't do anything with that for 5 years or something, then we got a real problem on our hands. Or you've got some exotic herb species or grass species, maybe some airhata or something like that. Okay, what is that doing? How is that airhata interacting with other species? Is it going to be an ecosystem blocker? Is it going to interact with natives and suppress native plants, or will it just do its own thing and then maybe eventually fade out as the native canopy thickens or something like that? Okay, so you go to a site and you think about these different groups and think about, okay, what is going to happen here, what is going to happen there? All right, you cannot do bushland restoration without thinking, how has the habitat got to where it is now, and what is its trajectory? Does anyone have any examples or anything like that? Anyone have anything to say regarding that particular tool of thought? No? Yes?
Well, I was thinking, you can often go to a site and have a look at, like the airhata, like you say. You can have an idea in mind, but if it's the first time you've been there, it can take time to actually understand what it's doing. You might have to watch it over time and over a few seasons, not even years, but just through autumn, winter, summer.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then you'll know. Then what you think about it, how it plays out there,
Yes.
might change.
Yes.
Yes.
So, and that's, you've got, sort of got to do that with everything that's going on. Give it a bit of time. You can have an idea in mind, but sometimes you could be surprised.
Yes. That's why when working with something as complex as this, you ideally gain experience over a number of years to understand how things unravel or develop. And in addition to that, not just from one season to the next, 1 year to the next, we have our La Nina and El Nino cycles. And there's a big difference between what happens during an El Nino and a La Nina, especially when it comes to weed control, having to do the herbicide spraying along the edge of a track or something like that. You really notice the difference between, say, what was present during the 2019-2020 drought, when we had those awful fires, and then 2 or 3 years later, when the climate had changed, when the cycle had changed, then shit gets really busy. I've tried to boil these down and order them in a particular way, but because these points interrelate, there isn't a logical means of ordering them really. There's not a natural first thing and a natural second thing, apart from starting on what does the contract say and what are the boundaries of your work site. Nevertheless, this kind of watching how the vegetation changes sort of takes you also to where is the resilience of a site. And by resilience, I mean which parts of the site have their natural capacity to recover or continue to maintain their natural vegetation. Which parts are going to, after damage, are going to heal most easily versus which parts of the site have lost their resilience. And we know that depends on the seed stock and the root stock in the soil. The area of a site that has soil damage is likely to have a low level of resilience, okay? The vegetation on the site starts with the stuff in the surface in the top 5 centimetres of the soil. That's where it all starts. You take that away and it's like, I don't know, cutting the feet out from someone. They will fall down and they will never get up, okay? It's a little bit more complicated than that because we know seed stock can come in from elsewhere too. But, think of a reserve where people have been parking their cars off a road into the bushland, and you've got compacted soil and you've got some fill that's been dropped in there or something like that, and the original soil is buried and compacted. We can kind of imagine what sort of species of weeds we've got growing around there, species of like African love grass or something like that, okay? That's a low resilience area versus some, say, imagine you've got some nice area on Middle Harbour and someone has gone in and cut down 200 trees to provide a view for some well-paying person in a $3 or $4 million house. And if that's all that's happened, and that's pretty terrible, I know, but if that's all that's happened, your bushland will recover because the soil and the seeds and the propagules in that in the ground there are still there. So that's what I mean by resilience, okay? And you know then that, yes, areas with resilience will heal after damage. Areas without resilience will not heal without a lot more help. And these strategies that you use for restoration in those two areas are going to be quite different. And the timescales on which things are going to be operating are going to be quite different as well. Now, my fifth point here, plant structural types, does plug in nicely to how is the vegetation changing over time. All these plants rely on light, and all other things being equal, water availability and that sort of thing is not entirely equal, but we can simplify things. All other things being equal, what determines how quickly these different plant groups can grow is how much sunlight they can get. Some plant structural types are going to be down low, and they're not going to get high, grasses and ferns and that sort of thing. Whereas you have a shrub layer, and then you have, say, a first tree layer, and then you might have a second or emergent tree layer. When you go into bushland on a site and you're thinking about what is happening here and how do I aid the recovery of this site from disturbance or weeds, you need to think about these different canopy layers. We've got a number of different canopy layers. Grass, the grass layer is a canopy layer. Obviously in a prairie, obviously in a prairie it's the only, or a grassland, it's the only canopy layer. Here we've got about four different canopy layers. In a rainforest, we would have a fifth canopy layer as well, and that is the vines that grow over the tops of trees. That's another canopy layer, okay? You need to think about your site and your vegetation and break it down into those different components to then think, okay, what's getting light, what's not getting light, how is this going to change over time? Where you have plants growing in shade, obviously they're getting less light, they're not able to photosynthesize at quite the same rate and grow new leaves and so on, so they'll be slowed down. The difference between, say, one of the joys of working in a rainforest, you might have all these weeds in a rainforest, but you know that when the rainforest is recovering, you're going to have a canopy that throws 70 to 95% shade. It's going to cut out, it's only going to let 30% to 5% of the light in. That means that you can really suppress the growth of exotic species down low. It's easy. It's really easy. Once, it's an easy goal and an easy strategy to have. When you're working in an open eucalypt forest, a healthy forest is still going to have, a canopy cover of maybe just 30 to 50%. So you've always got high light levels coming down to the ground level, which means you may well always have exotic grasses and annuals and that sort of thing coming up. Having worked in Sydney, I can see that there can be a perpetual battle fighting annuals and exotic grasses if indeed that is on your target list, and that may well not change. Having said that though, even getting a canopy that casts a 50% shade is better, it is going to be suppressing exotic species to some degree, as opposed to a canopy that's just providing 25% or 10% shade or something like that. Now, it occurred to me though also, sure, a eucalyptus canopy may not be providing a high density shade, but it drops something else. It's not just casting shade. What else is a canopy casting on the vegetation beneath it?
Leaves.
Yeah, exactly, leaves. Leaves are providing, in a sense, the first canopy layer, a canopy layer that sits on the soil surface. That is critical. And that, how do I put it? Even though that canopy may be a dead canopy, it's still functionally a canopy, and it's still something that you have to take into account in your strategy, and it is worth so much. If we wanted to stimulate, if we wanted to get more shrubs and ground layer species growing in here, the first thing we would have to do, maybe, is remove that canopy, that dead canopy. It's not photosynthesizing, but it's still cutting out the light. Okay? So we've got two kinds of canopy that we need to deal with. The first one, the dead canopy, in some places, maybe we have to consider that to be more important than this thin live canopy above us. Okay? Plant structural types also brings me to the point of, we've got exotic species growing in a site, and we need to be able to prioritise what exotic species we should be investing most of our time into. What are those various exotic species doing with their canopies? Often in littoral rainforest, we've got two main targets that we deal with. One of them will be ground asparagus that produces a dense ground layer and shrub layer canopy. But we have another category of plants which are ecosystem killers, and that is the vines. Okay? Exotic passion fruits and coastal ipomoea are great examples of that. They're ecosystem killers because they are vines and they will grow over the top of canopy and block the light out of trees and everything else below. They are ecosystem killers. So I would give them the highest priority, at least in littoral rainforest, okay, above all the other species. By overtopping the tallest canopy, they will shade out and starve the tallest canopy, and you end up with tree collapse. And interestingly, in rainforest, we also do control native vines, such as the native grape Cissus antarctica, Cissus hyperglauca. They're also, they can be ecosystem killers or they can be restoration blockers, because they are able to get to the tops of trees very rapidly, block out the light, and collapse trees as well, and block out the light of everything in all these other different structural layers down beneath. Okay? It's kind of interesting considering that you've got to control native species as well as exotic species when trying to get, restoration of some communities. accelerating forward. And once again, that is kind of all resting on the dynamic between this stuff that comes from this direction, light, and the stuff that's coming up in this direction, which is the plants growing. Because we have to prioritize as well, in order to get as much of an area treated as possible for as little effort and money, we need to think about weed control as not just removing weeds. We need to kind of invert the way we see it and think about the natives first. And we are removing weeds to make room for natives. We're not removing weeds just per se, okay? We're making room for natives. That means you can work in an area and even do a fast, shabby job over a very large area. You don't need to remove all of those weeds. You just need to thin them out, maybe, enough to make room for natives to be able to grow or regenerate. And then maybe you come through and thin the weeds a bit more later on. But you're making room for the natives. It's so easy in bush regen to be occupied with the weeds. Hey, that's all it's about. You know, you go in there, that's all it's about. We've got to remove these weeds, we've got to remove these, we've got to dig these out, we've got to herbicide spray those and whatever. It's really not about that. Remember, it's about bushland restoration. So it's about making opportunity and room for the native plants. And if you understand that, that means that you may not need to remove 100% of that lantana or 100% of that asparagus, or not only the adult asparagus plants, but the seedlings as well. You don't need to do that. You might just need to remove 50% of them for the time being, or just the adults, and leave the seedlings till next year or something. And with that, you know, you've cut down the amount of time you're investing in a site per square metre, and yet you are still getting regeneration. It really does change how you're investing your time. And when it comes to, that brings me to fast bulk reduction. So when you are working over a site, I was sort of taught initially in Sydney, when you work an area, you pick it clean. Okay, from one end of the reserve to the other, you pick it clean. You don't need to do that. And this occurred to me, this fast bulk reduction method occurred to me when I was weeding my veggie patch in the backyard. I was thinking about this sort of thing because often on our sites we will cover a very large area, okay, and we won't pick it clean. We'll just do the largest, maybe just the largest weeds or one or two species, and that's it. We'll do a shabby job over a very large area. And that kind of goes against the grain that I developed when working on small reserves in Sydney. And I was thinking about that a lot. And then one Friday afternoon, I find I'm weeding a vegetable patch. And what am I doing first? I'm not working from one end through to the other. I'm just going through and ripping up the big stuff first, getting the bulk of it out of the way. Even that makes a big difference. And then I can go through and pick it clean afterwards if I want. But the point is, if you go over a site and do the bulk work first, you can do it quickly and you don't need to work to like a 90% perfection level or something like that. Remember, you're you're removing weeds to make room for the natives. So you don't need to do a perfect job. If you do a bulk removal, a quick and shabby job over a large area, it also gives you the opportunity to be able to see the whole reserve, for instance, rather than spending a whole day in one corner and not getting to see the other part of the reserve. If you work through the whole of the reserve, you can gauge what is happening, what has happened there since you were there last time, which might be a week ago or a month ago or something like that. When I'm cleaning a kitchen bench top, the first thing I'll do is, with my hand or even a dirty rag, I'll just sweep the crumbs and the bits of vegetable and grated carrot and whatever off first. And then I'll go over again with a clean sponge or something, and then maybe on a third time, just to remove the moisture, then I'll go over there with a dry cloth or a tea towel or something like that. If you're sanding wood, you're going to use a coarse grain emery paper first. You don't start with a fine paper first. You want to go with a large grain first to get the larger imperfections out of the wood. And then you go over with a finer grain and then a finer grain again. We can apply exactly this to weed control on a bushland restoration site as well. And geez, it makes a big difference, hey? Rather than working one site to perfection while other areas are growing out of control, you can keep a lid on everything. Remember, a plant is a light-loving factory. Every one of those leaves is manufacturing sugar, manufacturing proteins and starch and what have you, with which to build extra leaves. So the larger a plant is, the more light it can harvest, and the more leaves it in turn can grow again. That means that larger plants can put on more growth than small plants. A 50-gram plant over the course of a year might manufacture just, say, 100 grams, an extra 100 grams of leaf tissue and bark and what have you. A tree that weighs a tonne it may well manufacture another tonne of material over the course of a year. That means that if you're weeding an area and you're just concentrating on one area, including the small plants, and you're leaving larger plants, larger exotic plants to grow, maybe it's a paspalum the size of a car or something like that, it's manufacturing a lot. It's really manufacturing a lot. So by the time you get back to it in 6 months or something like that, it's the size of a caravan, okay? Plants don't grow at a linear rate like that. They grow at a logarithmic rate because every time they manufacture a leaf, they've increased their ability to manufacture even more leaves. So you'll go from 1 leaf to 2 leaves to 4 leaves to 8 leaves to 16 leaves. You know what I mean? So larger plants will become bigger problems even more quickly than smaller plants. So work an area quickly, get the larger stuff first, and then go to a finer grain and then a finer grain after that. And in addition to that, of course, we know that larger plants are going to be closer to maturity and seed output than small plants. But we already knew that anyway. Okay, so that's one of the other principles that's really useful to stop and apply when you get to a site and you spend those first 5 minutes thinking, what is happening here? and how should I approach this site rather than rushing straight in. Outlier versus core infestations. Often we don't have time to completely remove even the large, the adults of a particular exotic plant from our site. So we have to leave some behind. We're better off removing, how do I put it? The shape of an infestation it tends to be irregular, and they tend to have tentacles of infestation running along roadsides, running down water, drainage lines, running along tracks, whatever. They also tend to have sort of satellite infestations. So the easiest way, the most efficient way of dealing with this sort of thing is, rather than getting the biggest core infestation, get those cleaner areas first and get the small infestations out of the way. Contain it and simplify it, and then work from the edges, okay? Disturbance can be a good thing. Back in the day when we had the Bradley sisters, for instance, bush regen used to be done in such a way that you minimise disturbance, because minimising disturbance minimises... disturbance allows for the germination of exotic plants. So you minimise disturbance on a site, you're going to have fewer weeds coming up. But what about all these plants? They tend to germinate after disturbance too, especially after the big hot reset of a bushfire. And I'd noticed going from one company into another many years ago now down at Narrabeen Lagoon, when they worked in an area, they did not care about disturbance at all. And the ground, that the leaf litter layer would be moved, plants would be ripped out and the roots had come out and disturbed the ground, and we'd do track work or something like that. And it was a real mess, but the amount of natives that came up because of the disturbance was really high. There was in one area, there was one or two examples of Hibiscus diversifolius. And I thought, this area should have more than that. And I even got to the point where I was making cuttings of this plant and trying to plant these cuttings around the edge of Narrabeen Lagoon to get more of this shrub species growing there. With the disturbance that we created building a track, we got hundreds of these plants growing up around the edge of the lagoon. I didn't need to do anything. All I needed to do was disturb the ground as an incidental thing of doing all this track work and weed control, and all these natives came up anyway. So disturbance, it may not always be a good thing, but I think I'd go so far as to say we can rely on disturbance generally being a good thing and stimulating native growth in addition to weed growth. Remember, what we're trying to do is get natives germinating and establishing on a site. We're not trying to just get rid of the exotic species. We're making room for natives. We're making opportunity for native species. So disturbance can be a good thing. Yeah.
To summarise it as optimal level of disturbance.
Summarise at optimal level.
Because in different situations, to one different degree.
Yes.
The Bradleys aren't necessarily wrong, but it's just optimal.
Yes. Yes.
Understanding everything in place.
Yeah. And that kind of, that brings us to the next one then. For example, don't bite off more than you can chew. So if you are working an area for the first time doing primary work, which will disturb a site and which will encourage native and exotic regeneration, you don't ideally want to work in an area that exceeds your capacity to control over the following year or two. By that I mean the amount of primary work you do needs to be tailored to how much secondary you can fit in. And in addition to that, and this is kind of, let's see, there's almost another rule that can go in. If you've got bushland and you've got a spectrum from it being totally clean to a complete weedy mess, right? And you've got the whole range, you've got a whole spectrum. So somewhere in the middle, let's say it's 50% weeds and 50% natives. Which is the best area to disturb and to treat? There's no point in, you're not going to prioritise working in an area that has, say, just 1% weed cover, which is, it might be actually quite easy to remove that 1% weed cover for sure. You're not going to prioritise working in an area that has 90 or 95%, maybe 90 or 95% weed cover, because you pretty much lost the battle there. What you really have to do is invest your time where you're going to lose ground most rapidly over the next 6 months or year. Conversely, you are going to invest your effort where you are going to gain the most ground most rapidly in 6 months or a year or something like that. So that'll be kind of like a middling level of weed infestation. If you've got an area imagine you've got an area and you've got all these patches of weeds over it, and 50% of that area is covered in weeds. And over the next 2 years, that will go to 90%. Think of the amount of ground that you've lost if you don't treat that area, while you have been treating this area that had 90 to 95% cover. You got that area back down to 50% cover, but you've actually lost the battle, in this other area. You haven't gained any ground. You've got to kind of think about it like warfare. Where are you going to gain the most ground for the least amount of effort or per unit effort? And it's often in the middle. And that'd probably mean then when you're going to disturb an area, what is the intensity of disturbance as well? Perhaps it's somewhere in the middle, and not a really high level of disturbance, not a really low level of disturbance. I think sometimes working an area, you may not know what you're going to get coming out of the ground once you've disturbed it, because you don't know the history of the site. You've got a suite of species in front of you now. That doesn't necessarily mean it was the same suite of species 20 years ago. You could have these. You could have a seed bank of a completely other, different bunch of exotic species, just sitting there waiting. So sometimes it's good to go for, a low level of disturbance just to see what's going to come up. To work an area using a sort of a sucker and see mode, just to work a small area, see what comes up over the next year. And then, once again, tailor your strategy to what is happening there. I'm not sure I don't have a clear answer to your question there, but it's...
It was more of a comment.
Yeah, and this is written on a whiteboard, on corflute. It's not written in stone. These are tools of thought. These are things that...
Marker, or is that white?
Yeah, yes, I can wipe it off. these are tools of thought. And I think they're all applicable. They can also all be questioned. And we need to be able to apply them, but question them as well. We just need to really go into an area, think about what is happening on our sites and how best to get into that battle. And sometimes you don't need to take prisoners as well. Sometimes you can actually treat them as friends. Hence, treating weeds as friends. Weeds provide canopy. And sometimes you might have certain species that are providing a canopy that are keeping a cap on other species. So don't knock these ones out yet. I don't know if anyone can think of any examples, but just before I ask, sometimes we work in littoral rainforest, and littoral rainforest exists in an environment, how do I put it? A windy environment, okay? And that wind, particularly during the warmer half of the year, is a sea breeze. And on the breeze, you have salt particles. Salt gathers on leaves. The leaf surfaces get too much sodium on them. The leaves burn. You end up with salt pruning of the canopy. That's why in a littoral rainforest, the canopy might just be this high. And then 30 metres back from the beach, it might be half the height of that, but you can see how the canopy of a littoral rainforest behind a beach is hedged. It's naturally hedged. If you're removing, if you're removing lantana from the leading edge of that canopy, you're breaching that canopy, you're breaching that protective skin of the littoral rainforest. And you can create holes in which the salt breeze will blow into the canopy, underneath the canopy. And what happens then? You've got your seedling layer getting hedged. You've got your seedling layer getting destroyed quite some way back into the rainforest. So if you've got damage then to the canopy, you've got nothing to replace it, okay? The canopy of a littoral rainforest is a protective skin. You need to retain that all the time. Now, it may get breached when you're dealing with bitu, and we do control bitu bush in coastal areas and maybe allow the breeze to get into the littoral rainforest, unfortunately. But there are other species we will leave, such as lantana or Norfolk Island hibiscus, okay? Definitely weeds, they've got their own problems, but for the moment, they are part of that protective skin and we need to retain that. Does anyone else have any examples of where you might leave natives, where you might leave exotic species to keep a cap on other exotic species? Anyone used exotic species as friends?
More with like re-veg, so a similar situation.
Yep.
Coastal re-veg and just say the eastern suburbs, you leave the prosma in place and plant behind it.
Yep.
Because the salt-laden wind would just burn
Yeah.
the seedling. So we found when we just left barriers there, just clear the section, leave a section, clear a section.
Yep.
And we could get the native mid-story up.
Yeah. And so when it comes to some of these coastal habitats as well, your restoration work often needs to work from the inside and work towards the direction in which the wind is coming from, work towards the beach, rather than working on the beach edge back, deeper in, away from the coastal edge. You're better off building a good, healthy, resilient vegetation layer forward into where the wind is coming from. If you've got, damaged littoral rainforest with, say, lantana and bitter and asparagus and vines and that sort of thing, make sure the interior of the forest is healthy first. Okay, because a healthy littoral rainforest will have a good layer of seedlings and, maybe a sort of like a shrub height of young trees as well. And the more dense that vegetation is, then the better those young trees and seedlings are going to withstand the onslaught of any salt coming in when you eventually get to those bitus and lantanas right on the leading edge.
Peter, before the lantana was there, is there a native species that is more usually ahead of the others? Not just the canopy one, but the one that might be more, or a couple that might be more tolerant to the salt, to be the skin.
Yeah.
Do you want that do you want to shape it to that level of detail so that those species are like right at the canopy, under the lantana?
Yeah, that's a good point actually, which kind of contravenes what I'm saying. Often you've got to have two different irons in the fire at the same time. Melanthera biflora is a scrambler, a little bit like lantana, okay? It belongs to the Asteraceae family. That is perfect for that. It will grow not on the absolute foredune, but certainly in the first swale. Yeah, and that is perfect for that.
Now there is Maroubra Beach, South Maroubra Beach, you'll see it there.
Okay. Can you think of any other examples?
Leave, like tobacco, so we just take the seed off that and leave that. But it's not just, so you're controlling the amount of sunlight getting to the lower story, but also for animals to perch on as well. The plants like that, you can get them later. We just leave them go and just harvest the seed.
Yeah. What do you reckon?
My supervisors often tell me don't bother taking out Solanum nigrum and Solanum americanum. Yeah, they're not that bad.
Of course. Yes. And if we're talking about, if we're talking about a rainforest environment, eventually they'll get shaded out. Are you talking about a little rainforest situation or?
Mainly Cumberland Plain and the transition zone like the hills.
Oh yeah. And say that those species proliferate, then do they stay in abundance forever, or what happens with those? Okay. And so you'll eventually lose those because the ground layer gets healthier and thickens up. So that's the canopy layer down there that will suppress them, huh? Okay. I got some soil from beneath a Solanum nigrum and scattered it around in my backyard because I had an area where I had compressed gravel and I deep ripped it with some green waste compost to try to start rebuilding the soil. It's still not a lot was growing there. So I cast this dune soil with Solanum nigrum seeds in it. And now I've got all this Solanum nigrum coming up. And it's good because it's bringing insects in like ladybirds, and I'm getting coals coming in there as well. And it's just helping build up the complexity, hey?
It's like a fodder crop.
Yes.
It's like a fodder crop.
Yeah, exactly. And it will, I'll get more structure in the ground, just...
Ongoing, just...
Yeah, that's right. And then it'll get shaded out with the rainforest species that I'm planting there as well. Finally, as much as I enjoy talking about making friends with the enemy, the last point is just keep it simple. So you might have a plan for a site, or you might have a plan for a day. Yes?
I just remember another weed that we often don't bother removing is Rumex crispus, the introduced dog.
Now, okay, Rumex crispus, not Rumex sagittata. That's different. That's a different situation, isn't it? Because that's a climber and a canopy killer. Rumex crispus, yeah, I've never seen that get to the density where it's an ecosystem blocker. Not all weeds are. That's right, yeah. But yeah, keep your strategy simple, you know. It might be a strategy for a whole site, or it might just be your strategy for the day. Keep it simple with maybe no more than 2 or 3 primary targets, you know, that may take, say, 80 or 90% of your energy, and then, you know, often you encounter other things that you weren't expecting for, and so you've got a bit of incidental effort and time to put into a few other things that you see. But all of this is about trying to bring a bit of order in perception and simplicity to all of this messy complexity, hey? And if you can take even just 1 or 2 of these rules and apply it, I think it will make a difference. Good luck, and keep enjoying the natives and the weeds.